given to a mafia boss as punishment. Her life was never the same again. I want you to picture the worst night of your life. Now double it, triple it, set it on fire and drop it into the sea. That still wouldn't come close to the night my father sold me. It didn't look like a sale. That's the thing about men like Marco Esposito. They never call their sins by their real names. He called it a debt settlement, a negotiation, a business arrangement between two reasonable men. I was 24 years old, standing in a warehouse that smelled like gun oil and rust and something sour I refused to identify, wearing a silk slip I'd thrown on in the dark when his men dragged me from my bed. My feet were bare, the concrete was cold, and my father, the man who once carried me on his shoulders through the markets of Palermo so I could touch the oranges, stood 3 feet away and could not meet my eyes. "She's yours now, Don Grimani," he said, voice like paper tearing. "Take her, keep her, do whatever you want. Just let the rest of us live." The silence that followed was the loudest thing I'd ever heard. I had heard of Don Dante Grimani the way you hear of storms before they arrive, in whispers, in the way people's eyes dropped when his name passed their lips, in the particular quality of stillness that fell over a room whenever one of his men walked in. They called him Inferno, not because he had a temper, because wherever he went, things burned. Rivals, empires, anyone foolish enough to mistake his patience for mercy. I had never seen him. I had taken great pains never to be in any room he occupied. And now he sat on a throne of black leather and polished chrome at the far end of the warehouse, firelight carving his face into something that didn't quite look real. Midnight hair pushed back, jaw like carved stone, a scar bisecting his left brow like God had tried to edit him and given up. Eyes the color of scorched whiskey. 34 years old and already more legend than man. He didn't stand when my father made his offer. He didn't smile, didn't recoil, didn't react at all. He simply studied me the way a man studies a chess piece, calculating, unhurried, absolute. Then, slowly, he rose. The room held its breath. He crossed the warehouse floor in 12 steps. I counted. I needed something to count. He stopped in front of me and one gloved hand lifted my chin, not roughly, which was somehow worse, with the delicate precision of a man who understood exactly how much force was required for any given situation. His thumb grazed my lower lip. "Given to me as punishment," he said. The voice was low, velvet scraped over gravel. "Your father steals 3 million euros and a shipment of pure Colombian product, and this..." His gaze traveled the length of me with the slow patience of someone reading a contract. "This is my compensation." I said nothing. My throat had locked. "I could have taken his hands," Dante continued, almost to himself. "His eyes, his tongue. There are 100 parts of a man that can be removed without killing him, and I know where every one of them is." A pause. "Instead, I take you. Every breath, every thought. Every morning you wake and realize you belong to me now." His eyes came back to mine. Something moved in them. Not cruelty exactly, but something older and more dangerous. "Until the day you forget your own name and only remember mine." He snapped his fingers. 2 of his men moved. My father screamed once, a short, wet sound, and was gone. I never saw Marco Esposito again. And in the strange, dislocated silence that followed, standing barefoot in a cold warehouse with a Mafia don's thumb still warm against my lips, I understood with perfect clarity that my life had just split cleanly in 2. The part that came before and everything that came after. I did not cry. I had learned very young that tears in front of dangerous men were currency, and I refused to spend mine on an audience. Instead, I looked Don Dante Grimani directly in his scorched whiskey eyes and said the only thing I could say. "If you're going to own me, at least let me have shoes." Something shifted in his expression, barely, like the surface of very deep water disturbed from below. He almost smiled. "Angelo," he said, without looking away from me. His consigliere materialized from the shadows. Iron Angel, Angelo Bianchi, a silver-haired man built like a monument, with eyes like chips of slate. He produced a pair of flat black slippers from somewhere with the efficiency of a man who anticipated everything. Dante Grimani watched me slide them on. Then he turned and walked toward the door. "Come, Vittoria," he said over his shoulder, as though I had a choice. As though I had ever had a choice from the moment his men knocked on my door. I followed, and heaven help me, in the years that came after, I would spend a great deal of time wondering whether the woman who walked through that warehouse door had any idea what she was walking into. She didn't, but she would learn. God, she would learn. If you already feel it in your chest, that pull, that dread, that dark little thrill, go ahead and subscribe. This story is only getting darker from here. The button costs you nothing. Leaving might cost you everything. They drove me through the night in a matte black Maybach that smelled of gun oil, aged leather, and something else. Dark and warm, and underneath everything, like a threat made of smoke. I sat in the back beside a man I had never met, who now apparently owned me, and I cataloged every detail I could because cataloging was the only power I had left. The car was armored, I could tell by the heft of the doors. The windows were one-way glass. We passed through 3 checkpoints before we left the city, each manned by men who didn't look at us, who looked only outward, rifles held the way professionals hold them, easy, ready, already aimed in their minds. Dante Grimani sat beside me and did not speak for 40 minutes. He had his phone. He scrolled, occasionally typed, made one short call in clipped Sicilian dialect I caught only fragments of. Business. Always business. I was furniture. I studied him the way you study a map of foreign territory, looking for the exits, the dangerous terrain, the places a person could get lost and never found. His hands were what I noticed most. Large, tanned. The gloves were off now, folded on his knee, and I could see a long, pale scar running from his right knuckle to his wrist. His nails were clean. His watch cost more than my father's entire debt. When he scrolled his phone, his jaw worked slightly. Not tension, I realized, but thought. He thought constantly. Behind those scorched whiskey eyes, something was always moving. "You're staring," he said, not looking up. "I'm assessing," I said. He did look up then, that barely there shift of expression again, the one I was already learning to read. Faint, private amusement. Assessing what? Whether you're as dangerous as they say. And? I turned back to the window. The jury's still out. He said nothing, but I felt something change in the quality of the silence between us. A slight recalibration, like a scope being adjusted. I had done something unexpected. He was taking note. Good. I needed him to take note of me as a person and not a problem to be managed. It was the only card I held. Villa Inferno materialized out of the Sicilian dark like something conjured rather than built. Iron gates 15 feet tall swung open as we approached. Inside, a world. A compound, really. The main villa, a long, pale structure of Baroque arches and Roman columns, its windows lit from within like amber eyes. Beyond it, outbuildings, a chapel, a garden that in daylight I would discover was obsessively maintained, not a single dead thing allowed to remain. I would later understand this was philosophical. Dante Grimani did not tolerate decay. My room, my suite, technically, occupied the entire east wing of the second floor. It was beautiful in the way that very expensive cages are beautiful. High ceilings, silk curtains, a four-poster bed dressed in deep burgundy, a balcony that overlooked the Tyrrhenian Sea. I stood on it in my stolen slippers and watched the black water move and understood that the sea, for all its vastness, was not an exit. Not from here. Not with the 2 armed guards I'd already counted below. A woman named Celia brought me clothes. A complete wardrobe, every size correct, every piece selected with an eye for quality, and a studied absence of anything that might be considered cheap. I stood in the center of the room and let her unpack it all, and tried not to think about what it meant that he already knew my measurements. He had known about me before tonight. That was the thing lodging in my chest like a cold stone. My father's deal had not been made tonight. This had been arranged. I had been chosen. The question that would keep me awake for weeks, was why? I had nothing. No money, no status, no connections worth leveraging. My father was a small-time courier who had made the catastrophically stupid mistake of skimming from the Grimani family and then trying to pin the loss on a rival shipment. I was a graphic designer who worked from a studio apartment in Palermo and spent her evenings reading and her weekends at the market and her nights doing absolutely nothing of consequence to anyone in the underworld. So why me? Why not just take Marco's hands and call it done? He came to my door at midnight, did not knock, simply opened it, stood in the frame, still dressed, jacket gone now, the first 2 buttons of his white shirt open, a glass of something amber in his hand, and looked at me. "You haven't eaten," he said. I wasn't hungry. "Eat anyway." He stepped back. "There's food downstairs. Celia will show you. And if I don't want to go downstairs, then you'll be hungry." A pause. I don't force women to eat, Vittoria. I don't force women to do most things. The way he said it, careful, deliberate, left enormous echoing space around the word most. "What things do you force?" I asked. He considered this with genuine seriousness. "Honesty," he said finally. "I force honesty." He lifted his glass slightly, a gesture that wasn't quite a toast. "Good night." He was gone before I could reply. I stood in the doorway of my gilded cage and breathed and told myself what I needed to believe, that I was a rational woman in an irrational situation, and I would survive it with my mind intact. I would watch. I would wait. I would find the angle. I did not yet know that the angle had already found me, that it had dark hair and scorched whiskey eyes and was moving through the room below me, glass in hand, already thinking 3 moves ahead, already thinking about me. A week passed, then another. I did not run. I want to be honest about that. I considered it, mapped it, calculated the odds 3 different ways, and arrived each time at the same conclusion. The gates were electronic. The perimeter was patrolled every 20 minutes by men who knew every inch of the grounds, and the sea cliffs on the east side were a 100-foot drop onto rocks. Running was a fantasy. Survival was a discipline. So I learned the villa instead. Mornings, Dante trained in the inner courtyard, shirtless, sweat dark, moving through a combat routine with a methodical brutality that was almost meditative. His men fired live rounds past him, close enough that the air moved, and he didn't flinch. Once I watched from an upper window as a shot clipped his shoulder, a graze, nothing more, and he simply adjusted his stance, pressed 2 fingers to the wound, checked for depth, and continued. No sound, no pause. Afternoons, the study. I learned to identify his moods by what leaked under the closed door. Silence meant negotiations. Low voices meant his capos reporting. A single raised word, only ever one, only ever his, meant someone had made an error they would not make twice. I never heard shouting. Dante Grimani did not shout. Men who shouted, I was learning, were men who needed volume to compensate for the authority they lacked. He had authority the way stone has weight, simply, totally, without effort. Evenings were mine. Celia brought meals. I read, drew in a sketchbook Celia had produced without my asking, which meant he'd thought of it, and tried to hold the shape of my old life in my mind like a photograph going soft at the edges. Then came the summons. Day 11. Celia knocked at 7 in the evening and held up a dress. Black, narrow-strapped, floor-length, understated in the way that only truly expensive things can afford to be understated. Beside it, a single card on heavy paper. Dinner, 8 p.m. Study. No signature. He was the only person here who sent notes. The study was nothing like I'd imagined. I'd pictured something deliberately intimidating, all dark wood and mounted weapons and the heads of enemies on the walls. Instead, it was almost warm. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, real books in real disorder, some with cracked spines and margin notes visible where they'd been left open. A fire, 2 chairs angled toward it, a desk of ancient oak that had clearly survived several different centuries, and Dante, standing with his back to me when I entered, looking out the window at the dark sea. He turned when the door closed. He looked at me the way he always looked, taking inventory, and then nodded once, as though I had confirmed something. Sit, he said, and it wasn't cruel, just direct. I won't ask you twice. I sat, because I wanted to, not because he'd told me to. I told myself that and believed it mostly. Dinner appeared, served by a man who moved like a shadow, was gone before the plates were settled. Real food, not a display, not a performance. Pasta with something dark and rich, wine the color of old blood, bread that still had heat in it. We ate. He didn't speak immediately. Neither did I. It wasn't uncomfortable, which was itself uncomfortable. Finally, he said, "You read." Yes. What? Everything. I paused. Currently, Pavese. Before that, Shasha. Before that, half the Grimani family history, since it was the only thing in the library I hadn't already read. His fork stopped. Which volume? The handwritten one. Blue cover, no title. I assume it's private. I read it anyway. Forgive me. The silence extended precisely 2 seconds. Then, what did you learn? That your grandfather built this family out of nothing during the war. That your father nearly destroyed it through arrogance. That you took control at 26, which means you inherited a burning building and chose not to run. I met his eyes. And that you have not taken a woman into this house since your wife died 4 years ago. absolute stillness. "You are thorough," he said. "I told you I was assessing." He lifted his wine, drank, set it down. And then, for the first time, he asked me something that had nothing to do with logistics or leverage or the situation we were in. "What did Pavese say that kept you reading?" And I found myself answering, really answering, about loneliness as structure, about the way Pavese wrote solitude not as absence, but as its own kind of presence. Dante listened the way very few people listen, without preparing his own response, without performing interest, just receiving. We talked until the fire burned low, about literature, about Sicily, about the architecture of things built to last. When he finally stood, it was past midnight. He walked me to the base of the stairs, which he'd never done before. Stopped there. "You'll join me for dinner again," he said, not a question. "Will I have a choice?" "You always have a choice." His eyes held mine. "The consequences vary." He went back to his study. The door closed. The fire behind it crackled on. I stood at the base of the stairs for a moment too long. Something in my chest was doing something I didn't have a word for yet. Something that was not quite fear and not quite its opposite. I went upstairs. I did not sleep for a long time. The next evening, without being summoned, I knocked on the study door at 8 o'clock. When he opened it, he was already smiling. That barely there smile I was learning to read like a second language. "Sit," he said. I sat, because I wanted to. The moment Vita knocked on that door without being summoned, was that strength, surrender, or something in between? Drop your read. I want to know. I need to tell you about Luca. Because everything else, every choice I made in that house, every line I crossed and every one I held, threads back to my brother. Luca Castellano was 21, 17 months younger than me, and the only person in our family who had ever actually loved without calculation. Where our father was angles and evasions, Luca was direct, embarrassingly, beautifully direct. He called things what they were. He said, "I love you," the way most people say good morning, casually and constantly, as though it cost nothing because it didn't. I had not spoken to him since the warehouse. Celia had brought me a phone, a new one, a controlled one, and when I tried to call his number, the line connected but produced only silence. Monitored. Everything was monitored. I brought this to Dante at dinner on the 16th night. "My brother," I said. "I want to know he's safe." "He is." "I'd like to hear that from him." Dante looked at me for a long moment. Then he reached into his jacket, produced a different phone, his own, scrolled to a number, and placed it on the table in front of me. 15 minutes, he said. "I'll be here. Speak freely." The call connected on the second ring. Luca's voice. "Hello?" "It's me." A silence, and then, "Vita." The relief in that single syllable. "Vita, are you okay? Where are you? What is—" "I'm safe," I said, precisely, carefully. "I'm being treated well. I need you to stay where you are and not do anything. Do you understand me? Nothing. Whatever you're planning, don't." He was crying. Luca, who I had never once seen cry, who laughed in the face of everything, was crying quietly on the other end of a phone in a room I couldn't picture. "I'll come for you, Vita. I'll find a way. Luca." My voice was steady. "Trust me. I will come home when I can come home. Until then, you stay safe. Promise me." He promised. It cost him something. I handed the phone back to Dante without speaking. He took it, said nothing about what he'd heard, though he'd heard everything. 3 days later, Celia brought a message, unsigned on the same heavy notepaper. A Palermo address, a date, a time. The next morning, we drove into the city in the armored Maybach. 4 cars, 7 men. And me, in a dark wool dress, wondering what new negotiation I was walking into. We stopped outside a medical clinic. A real one, civilian, clean, a sign about oncology in the window. Dante opened the car door himself. "Your brother has been having headaches," he said. "Severe ones. Since last year, from what I understand. He couldn't afford the specialist." I stared at him. "The appointment is paid for. The imaging is today. Whatever comes next, we handle it." His expression was unreadable. He doesn't know who arranged it, only that it's done. I found Luca in the waiting room. He looked up and his whole face broke apart and remade itself into something I had never seen on him before. A man trying not to fall apart in public. I held him together. I let him hold me. We sat in those plastic chairs and spoke in whispers for 40 minutes while his name was called and tests were run, and a world-class neurologist confirmed what the headaches had been hinting at for a year. A benign cyst. Operable. Not yet urgent, but requiring management. The doctor was already booked. The surgery date was already arranged. Dante waited in the car throughout. When I climbed back in, my face was dry. I'd done my crying in a bathroom stall, privately, where it was mine. And he was on his phone as though nothing had happened. We drove back in silence. That night I came to dinner, and I looked across the table at Don Dante Grimani, and I felt the ground shift beneath me in a way that had nothing to do with fear. He had done something no one had asked him to do. He had done it without announcement, without leverage, without asking for gratitude. He had simply done it because he could. "Why?" I asked. He didn't pretend not to understand. "Because he's yours," he said, "and you are mine." Simple. Absolute. Devastating. I sat with that for the rest of the meal and tried to find the manipulation in it, the calculation, the angle, because there had to be one. Men like Dante Grimani did not give gifts without price tags. But the invoice never arrived, and that, I was beginning to understand, was more dangerous than anything that came with a bill. There is a particular kind of torture that requires no tools, no threats, no raised voice. It is the torture of proximity, of learning the specific gravity of another person, of realizing you have memorized them, the sound of their footstep on marble at a particular hour, the particular quality of their silence when they are thinking, against the quality of their silence when they are simply present, without ever deciding to. By the 5th week, I knew Dante Grimani the way you know a house you've lived in long enough. Not by studying it, but by moving through it until its dimensions become your dimensions. I knew his coffee order. I knew he read history before bed and philosophy in the margins of reports. I knew the scar on his brow tightened when he was making a decision he found distasteful. I knew that he was capable of extraordinary stillness, and that the stillness was not peace, but something much more controlled and much more costly. And I knew, with the sick, precise clarity of a woman who has been lying to herself for weeks, that I was no longer simply surviving. The night it shifted, we were in the library. This had become our third space, the study for dinner, the balcony for when words failed us, and the library for everything in between. He had taken to reading across from me in the evenings, each of us in separate chairs, a lamp between us, the kind of silence that other people might have called comfortable. I was not comfortable. I was extremely aware. He was reading Thucydides. I was supposed to be reading anything at all. Instead, I was watching his hands turn pages, those scarred, careful hands, and hating myself a little. "You're not reading," he said without looking up. "I'm resting my eyes." "Your eyes were open." "I rest them open sometimes. It's a skill." He closed his book on a finger, looked at me. The firelight was generous with his face, filling in the harder angles, catching in his eyes in a way that made them less scorched and more golden, warm. He looked, in that specific light, like a man who could have been anything. "What are you actually thinking about?" he asked. "Pavese," I lied. "Try again." The fire popped. Outside, rain had started, the slow, heavy kind that sounds like breathing. I set my own book down. "I'm thinking," I said carefully, "about the fact that you are a great deal more complicated than I expected you to be. And that complication is inconvenient." "Inconvenient?" "Yes." He considered this. Then he stood, which I hadn't expected, and crossed the room slowly. Not toward me, past me, to the window, where the rain was writing itself on the glass. He stood with his back to me for a moment. "When Elena died," he said, his wife, I understood without being told, "I made a decision that I would not want anything I could not own completely, that I would not feel things that required return." He paused. The rain intensified. "It was a clean system." "Was?" I said. He turned, and whatever he'd meant to say next, he didn't say, because I was standing. I hadn't meant to stand, I was standing, and the distance between us had become a different kind of thing than it had been a moment ago. He crossed to me in 3 steps, slow ones. He stopped close enough that I could feel the warmth of him and see the exact texture of the scar above his brow, and I thought, this is the moment. This is the moment that divides things. His hand came up, not to my chin this time, to my face. His palm, warm and rough and careful, against my cheek. His thumb traced the line of my cheekbone like he was memorizing the architecture of it. "I should not want things I can't keep," he said very quietly. "You own me," I said, "by your own account." Owning is not the same as keeping. His eyes dropped briefly to my mouth, back to my eyes. "And you know that." He kissed me, not urgently, slowly, deliberately, with the same methodical patience he brought to everything. And I kissed him back. I won't dress it up or explain it away or blame it on vulnerability or captivity or the rain. I kissed him back because I wanted to. Because weeks of proximity and complexity and this man's infuriating inability to be the monster I needed him to be had worn down every wall I'd built. And what was underneath the walls was this. Want. Clear, inconvenient, undeniable want. We stayed in that library until the fire burned low and the rain eased and the house went fully quiet. When I finally went upstairs, alone, he didn't follow, which somehow made it worse, I stood in the dark of my room and pressed my hand to the place where his palm had been. The next morning at breakfast, he behaved exactly as he always had. Coffee, phone, brief, efficient exchange about the day's schedule, as though nothing had changed. Everything had changed. We both knew it. We said nothing. And in the knowing and the silence, something between us took root. Quiet as a seed, dark as a root system, as patient as anything that has learned to grow in difficult soil. The pocket watch had belonged to my father. I know how that sounds. Why would I keep anything of Marco Esposito's? But it had been his father's first, and his father's father's before that. A small silver thing with the Esposito family crest worn smooth by 100 years of thumbs, and it was the only object I had brought from my old life. Dante had allowed it, which told me something. Either he knew what it was and had calculated it was harmless, or he hadn't checked. I should have known. Dante always checked. I found the letter on the 33rd day, and finding it came from boredom and grief and an idle afternoon. I had taken the watch apart once when I was a teenager, cleaning it, and knew the case back had a secondary cavity behind the mechanism. Space for a folded paper. Space for something hidden. The paper was thin and old and folded 4 times. My father's handwriting, cramped and rushed, the letters of a man who wrote in fear. I read it standing by the window with the afternoon light failing, and by the time I finished it, I had sat down on the floor without meaning to. Marco hadn't just stolen from Dante Grimani. That was the surface of it, the story everyone knew. Beneath it was something uglier and more intricate. He had been working with Silvio Orsini, the Serpent, Dante's most dangerous rival, a man who had been trying to dismantle the Grimani Empire for a decade, feeding information about Grimani shipments, routes, schedules, contacts. 3 years of slow betrayal. The stolen money was almost incidental. What Silvio had been buying was access. And giving me to Dante? That was the final move. Not mercy, not a debt payment, a weapon. My father had written it plainly, without apparent shame. Silvio's plan was for me to get close to Dante, to earn his trust or his desire, or both, and to slip poison into his wine at the right moment. A quiet death. Treachery dressed as heartbreak. The letter included a small folded paper inside the main one, a name, a contact, a drop point for the poison itself. I was a Trojan horse. And I had been destroying myself from the inside, trying not to fall in love with the man I was meant to kill. I sat on the floor for a long time. Then I went to find Dante. He was in the study. Of course he was. The door was open, which was new, and he was at his desk with Angelo and 2 capos, talking in low, rapid Sicilian. He looked up when I appeared in the doorway. Something in my face made him stop mid-sentence. "Out," he said to the room. They left. The door closed. I crossed the room and placed the letter on his desk and stepped back. He read it. He read it again. His expression did not change, not a flicker, but his hand stilled completely on the paper, and I had learned enough to know that absolute stillness, for him, was the equivalent of any other man breaking things. The silence expanded. "You found this today," he said. "An hour ago. I came directly here." "You could have destroyed it." "Yes." "You could have found the contact, completed the original plan." My chest was tight. "Yes." He stood then, came around the desk with that slow, terrifying patience, stopped in front of me. "Why didn't you?" he asked, genuinely asking, not threatening, not performing, asking. "Because..." I stopped, started again. "Because I am many things, Dante. I am frightened, and I am angry, and I am in a situation I did not choose, and I have complicated feelings about every inch of this house and every moment I have spent in it." I held his gaze. "But I am not an assassin, and he is not my father anymore, and you are..." I stopped there, because the word was too large. He looked at me for a long moment. Something moved through his face. Not the barely there thing I was used to reading, but something unguarded. Something I didn't have vocabulary for yet. He laughed. Low. Dark. Rich with something that wasn't entirely humor. "So the little bird was meant to be my ending," he said. "Tell me, Vita." He stepped closer, and the air between us changed the way it always changed now, charged and complicated. "Did you ever imagine it? Even once?" "No," I said. "No," he repeated, like he was tasting the word, deciding if he believed it. "I found it and I brought it to you," I said. "That is my answer." He reached up, touched my face, that same gesture, palm to cheek, but slower now, with a weight it hadn't carried before. When he kissed me this time, it was different from the library. Not patience, not careful. Something underneath the careful. Something that had been building for 33 days, breaking through. He walked me backward until my shoulders met the bookshelves. His mouth was at my jaw, my throat, the curve of my shoulder. I had my hands in his hair, and I was thinking clearly enough to know I had stopped thinking clearly. Afterward, we lay in the dark of his room, the first time I had been in his room, and he told me about Elena, his wife. How she had died. A rival's bullet meant for him. Wrong car, wrong night, the awful geometry of proximity to a dangerous man. How the guilt had reconstructed him. How he had become, in the years since, someone who did not permit himself softness, because softness, in his world, was where the wounds went in. "And now?" I said. He said nothing for a long time. Outside, the sea made its sound, patient, unceasing, indifferent to kingdoms and debts and the complicated arrangements of men and women in the dark. "Now," he said, "I am going to destroy Silvio Orsini." He paused. "And then we'll see." Comment below. Vita had the letter. She had the contact. She had the means. Would you have done what she did? Or taken the other road? No wrong answers. I genuinely want to know. The war in the underworld does not announce itself. It doesn't send invitations or declarations. It arrives the way a fault line arrives, as silence, then as a sound you've never heard before, then as the ground beneath you becoming something other than solid. The first sign was a club, one of Dante's, a place near the waterfront called L'Ombra, dim and beautiful, the kind of establishment that served excellent whiskey to men who had done terrible things and would do them again tomorrow. A device in the sound system, planted during a private party 2 weeks before. When it detonated at 2 a.m, the building had been cleared of civilians. Someone had called in a credible threat to city emergency services 30 minutes prior, which cleared the street. 3 of Dante's men, still doing a final sweep, did not survive. He told me at breakfast, calmly, in the way he told me things now, as though I had graduated to a category of person who was told things. His face was composed. His coffee was untouched. He said their names, all 3. "Silvio," I said, without question. He set his cup down with great precision. He knows I have the letter. He knows the plan failed. He's moved to direct action. "What do you do?" "What I always do," he said. "I answer." The next 10 days were the hardest of my time in that house. Not because of anything that happened to me. I was protected with a kind of intensity that was almost suffocating. A rotation of guards, movement restricted, the windows of my suite covered each night. But because of what I could feel happening around me. The villa was different, quieter and yet more populated. Men I hadn't seen before arrived and were absorbed into the compound's operations without introduction. Angelo was constantly in motion, his face doing a version of tension I hadn't seen on it before. Dante worked through the night. He still came to find me. That was the thing I couldn't fully accommodate. In the middle of what was clearly a crisis of the kind that ends empires or men, he carved out time. An hour here, dinner there, once a full evening in the library where we did not speak about any of it. It wasn't escapism. It felt, rather, like a man tending to something he had decided mattered. The second strike was personal. I was on the balcony at dusk, a book I hadn't read a word of in my lap, when Celia appeared in the doorway with something wrong in her face. "There's a call," she said. He said you should take it privately. He's sending it to your phone. He, she said, not Don Grimani. She didn't say who. The phone rang. I answered. Vittoria. The voice was smooth, middle-aged, Palermo accented, controlled. My name is Silvio Orsini. I believe you've heard of me. I said nothing. My hand was very steady. I was proud of it. I have your brother, Silvio said. Luca. He's safe. For now, he's completely safe. I want you to understand that. I'm not a monster, regardless of what the Inferno has told you. A pause, calculated. I want to offer you something, Vittoria. A trade. Your cooperation. Very simple, very final. For your brother's safe return and your own freedom. Tonight. One thing and everything you've lost comes back. What one thing? I said. Tell me where Dante sleeps. Which room? Which side of the villa? Which window? The balcony air moved around me. Below, the garden was blue in the fading light. So you can kill him in his bed, I said. So the war ends, Silvio corrected pleasantly. You go home. Your brother recovers. The Grimani Empire passes into more reasonable hands. Everyone benefits. I thought about Luca, his voice on the phone. I'll come for you, Vita. I'll find a way. Of course he'd tried to find a way. Of course he'd gotten himself caught doing it. I thought about 3 names said calmly at a breakfast table. 3 men who would not come home. I thought about a palm, warm and rough and careful, pressed to my cheek. Call me back in 1 hour, I said. I need to think. Silvio's pause was satisfied. He thought he had me. 1 hour, he agreed. I went immediately to find Dante. He was in the operations room, a place I had never been, a room stripped of everything but screens and maps and men, the architecture of war. He looked up when I walked in, and before I could speak, I held up the phone. Silvio has Luca, I said. He wants your location. He thinks he has an hour to wait. The operations room went completely still. Dante looked at me for one long moment. Then he crossed to me, took the phone, handed it to Angelo without looking at him, and put both hands on my face. He's going to be fine, he said, quietly, just to me. I know, I said, and I did know, which was maybe the strangest thing of all, that in this room full of weapons and maps and men built for exactly this kind of crisis, with my brother in the hands of our enemy and an hour counting down, I was absolutely certain. Because the man in front of me was Don Dante Grimani. And Don Dante Grimani did not lose. Give me 58 minutes, he said. I nodded. He let go of my face and turned back to the room, and the room ignited. I have replayed the next 6 hours so many times that the memory has become worn smooth, like sea glass, the sharp edges gone, only the shape remaining. While Dante's men moved through the city in layers, some visible, some not, some playing angles I still don't fully understand, I sat in my room with Celia, who said nothing helpful and was therefore the perfect company. We did not speak. She brought tea I didn't drink. I held the phone and watched the minutes pass, and when 59 minutes had elapsed, I called Silvio back. Well, he said. I'll do it, I said. The east wing, 3rd floor, the window with the iron balcony. Midnight. A pause. Satisfied. Good girl. I ended the call and felt cold all the way through. Not because of what I'd said, because of what I'd said instead of the truth. The east wing, 3rd floor, iron balcony. That was my room, not Dante's. My room, which had been emptied of everything that mattered 2 hours before, on Dante's instruction, with his men already arrayed in positions I didn't know and couldn't map. I was not the plan. I was the door. At 11:45, they breached the east wing. 4 men, through the balcony, silent and professional in the way of people who do this for a living. They were in my empty room for 12 seconds before they understood. Dante's men were faster. I heard it from the hallway. Controlled chaos, the specific sounds of a professional operation. Hard commands in Sicilian, the thud of bodies meeting walls, 2 gunshots. Then silence. Then Angelo's voice saying something crisp into a radio. And then the part I did not expect. 1 man had not gone through the balcony. 1 man had come in through the corridor, a route no one had told Silvio about, a route that shouldn't have been accessible. And he found me in the hallway with Celia at my back and a gun in his hand that he was not pointing at the ceiling. He pointed it at me. "Move," he said. I was wearing a silk robe and I had been given a hairpin 2 weeks before, a gift, diamond-encrusted, which I had thought was extravagance and which I now understood was preparation. I had worn it every day. I was wearing it now. The man reached for my arm. I moved, not away, toward, inside his reach, where the gun was no longer useful, and drove the hairpin into the side of his throat with every gram of intention I had. He went down. It was not like anything I had imagined it would feel like. It was fast and ugly and absolutely necessary. And then Celia was screaming behind me, and there was blood on my sleeve. And Dante came through the stairwell door at a run with 2 men behind him and stopped when he saw me. Standing, hairpin in hand, the man on the floor. The expression on his face, I will remember it as long as I live. It was not shock. It was something that passed through him like weather. Relief, pride, something that cracked open in the back of his eyes and was gone before I could fully name it. He crossed to me, took my face in both hands. "Are you hurt?" "No. Is Luca?" "He's out. He's safe. Angelo has him." His eyes searched me. "You're sure you're not hurt?" "I'm sure." He looked at the man on the floor, back to me, a short exhale. "The hairpin," he said. "Was a gift," I said. He made a sound that was half breath, half something that lived in the same country as laughter, but had a much more complicated passport. He pulled me against him and held me in the hallway while his men moved through the villa and the night made its sounds outside, and somewhere below us, Silvio Orsini's plan finished its collapse. I let myself be held, because it was not surrender, because holding and being held, I was learning, were not the same as weakness. They were just true, human. The most honest things available in an otherwise very complicated world. "He underestimated you," Dante said into my hair. "Everyone does," I said. "Not anymore." I pulled back enough to see his face. There was blood on his shirt, not his, and his jaw was set in the particular way that meant decisions had been made. Final ones. "Silvio," I said. "Tomorrow," he said. "Tonight, you stay with me." I stayed. Not because he asked, and not because the alternative was uncertain, because it was what I wanted. Because at some point in the previous weeks, without announcement or ceremony, I had stopped being a woman who was taken and become a woman who was choosing. And that night, in the dark, I chose. I chose him. I chose this complicated, infuriating, devastating man who had entered my life as punishment and somehow become the only version of the future I could imagine standing in. She had every reason to betray him. Instead, she handed him the weapon. At what exact moment do you think Vita stopped surviving and started choosing? Drop a timestamp. I read every comment. Silvio Serpent Orsini had a particular fondness for the coast. He owned a property, not a home exactly, more a fortress with good views, on the cliffs above Cefalù, 2 hours east of Palermo, behind electronic gates and a wall of men who were paid extremely well not to blink. He'd owned it for 12 years. He had survived 11 attempts on his life in that time. He was 61 years old and believed, with the confidence of a man who has outmaneuvered everyone, that he was essentially untouchable. He was wrong. He'd been wrong from the moment he decided to use me. Dante moved on the property at 3 a.m, 4 days after the villa breach. He didn't take me. I want to be honest about that. I asked and was told no with exactly the degree of absolute firmness that told me the conversation was over. He took 14 men and Angelo, and they went in the dark with the efficiency of people who have done this before and understand what the work requires. I waited at Villa Inferno with Luca. My brother had arrived the previous evening, thin, bruised on one forearm where restraints had been, otherwise unhurt, and incandescent with a complex combination of fury and relief that kept cycling through his face every 30 seconds. He sat across from me in the library and stared. "You're different," he said. "I've had an unusual few months." "That's not what I mean." He studied me. "You're not," he searched for it, "braced anymore. You used to walk braced, like you were always waiting for impact." I thought about that. "Maybe I got tired of waiting," I said. He looked around the library, the real books, the fire, the room that had become, without my noticing, my room, and back at me. "Do you want to leave? When this is done, when it's safe, do you want to come home?" The question landed with surprising weight. I was quiet for a long time. Outside, the sea moved in the dark. The villa was quiet around us, most of the men gone with Dante, a skeleton crew remaining, the compound holding its breath. "I don't know where home is anymore," I said finally. "I thought I did. Then I came here and found out I'd been keeping a very small version of it." Luca processed this. He was 21 and perceptive and honest, and so he said only, "Is he good to you?" "In ways I didn't expect," I said. "In ways I'm still learning to accept." He nodded, slowly, the nod of a young man absorbing something that will take years to fully understand. "Okay," he said. "Okay, Vita." We sat together until I fell asleep in the chair, which I hadn't done since childhood. When I woke, he'd covered me with a blanket from the sofa and was asleep across from me, his face younger in rest, the lines of worry smoothed out. Dante returned at dawn. I heard the gates, heard the cars, heard the particular sound of a compound exhaling, the small sounds of men standing down, tension releasing, the world remembering how to be ordinary. I was on the balcony when he came through the garden below. He looked up. He was carrying his jacket over one arm. There was a cut above his right ear, already cleaned, small enough that tomorrow it would be nothing. He held my gaze for a moment, nodded once. Done. I found him in the kitchen of all places, which he almost never entered, standing at the counter with a glass of water, and the unexpected domesticity of it broke something open in me that I hadn't known was waiting. "Tell me," I said. "Silvio is gone." No elaboration, no performance. His network is dissolving. Angelo is handling the transition. In 3 days, it's over. And his people? The ones who had Luca? Handled. I nodded. In another life, the before life, the smaller life, those two words would have horrified me. Here they were simply true, and the truth of them settled in me without disruption. "You're all right," I said. Not a question. "I'm all right." He set down his water and crossed to me, and I met him halfway, and we stood in the kitchen in the gray dawn light, and he held me with his forehead against my temple, and for a long moment, neither of us said anything at all. Then he said, "I want to show you something." He drove us himself, no escort, for the first time, which was its own statement, to the eastern edge of the property where the cliffs dropped toward the sea. The sun was just clearing the horizon, painting everything red gold, the water far below hammered into copper. We stood at the edge. The wind was enormous. "I used to come here when things were very bad," he said. "After Elena, after my father, when I didn't know if what I was building would hold." He looked out at the water. "I would stand here and ask myself if it was worth it, all of it, the blood and the weight and the cost." "What did you decide?" I said. "That I couldn't answer the question correctly alone." He turned to look at me. I was always missing a variable. He reached into his jacket, produced a small dark box. Inside, a ring. Not the declaration I might have imagined once. Not white diamonds and ceremony and everything polished. A black diamond at the center, deep and light-eating and old, surrounded by tiny rubies the exact color of the sunrise behind us. It looked like something that had survived a great deal. Something that would survive more. "I'm not going to tell you it's a fairy tale," he said. "This world is what it is. The danger is what it is. I will not be smaller to make you comfortable, and I would not want you smaller either. But I want you beside me, in every room, in every decision. I want the woman who brought me that letter when she could have used it against me. I want the woman who stood in my hallway with a hairpin and a steady hand." His voice dropped. "I want Vittoria Grimani." The wind moved between us. Far below, the sea was already going about its ancient, indifferent business. I thought about my father's warehouse, about bare feet on cold concrete, about the night I was given away like a coin. I thought about everything that had grown in the space between that night and this morning. Difficult, dark, improbable things, rooted in complicated soil, refusing to die. I took the ring from the box and put it on my own hand. "Equal," I said. "In every room, in every decision. I will not stand behind you at any table." "Beside," he said. I said, "Beside." "Then we agree." He took my ringed hand and raised it to his mouth and pressed his lips to the knuckle just above the black diamond, and the sun came fully up, and the sea went from copper to gold, and the world did what it always does, kept moving, kept happening, completely indifferent to the small and enormous things that were occurring on a cliff above it. In the months that followed, they started calling me La Vittoria. The underworld, which names things with the blunt practicality of people who deal in consequences, they called me La Vittoria, the victory. I sat beside Dante at every table. I wore dark clothes and quiet knives and spoke only when I had something worth saying, which was often. Luca had his surgery. He recovered. He visited monthly. He and Dante played chess and argued about football and found their own specific, unexpected rhythm, which made me happier than almost anything else. My old life, the apartment, the studio, the careful, small orbit, became something I remembered with affection and without grief. It had been real. it had also been incomplete. And on the nights when the world finally went quiet, when the last of the doors had closed and the fire had burned low and the sea could be heard moving below the cliffs, Dante would pull me against him, press his lips to the scar on my collarbone, the one Silvio's man had left, and say the word that had frightened me at the beginning. Mine. And I would sink my teeth into his shoulder, gently, and answer, ours. Because that was the truth. Not possession, partnership. Not punishment, transformation. I had been given to a mafia boss to settle a debt, and somewhere in the smoke and the complexity and the terrible, inconvenient arithmetic of proximity, I had become something neither of us had planned for. I had become the thing he couldn't afford to lose. And he had become the thing worth staying for. Her life was never the same again. She was grateful.
And that, my darlings, is the complete story of Vittoria Castellano, given away like a debt, walked through fire, and arrived on the other side as something entirely her own. If any part of this story lived in your chest, if Vita's choice in that library, or her steady hand in that hallway, or the way she said, ours instead of yours, hit you somewhere true, I want to hear about it. Drop a comment. Tell me the moment that broke you open. Tell me which version of Vita you saw yourself in. And if you haven't subscribed yet, it takes 1 second and it means the next story finds you automatically. No searching, no missing it. Just more darkness, more depth, more stories that don't ask you to choose between intelligent and obsessed. I'll see you in the shadows. Stay.